Coming up next on the Witness the World podcast, the road less traveled.
Happiness equals pleasure plus purpose over time. And that we need to have a balance of pursuing pleasurable things, things we like, things that we enjoy, as well as having a purpose, doing something that feels meaningful. And that those two things in balance with each other, played out over time, is what creates happiness.
Good day, everyone. Welcome to episode 32 of the Witness the World podcast. My name is Ben Choi, and today we'll be heading to the Ivory Coast to learn, grow, and evolve as we become better versions of ourselves. On today's podcast, we'll be chatting with a seasoned traveler who's been to over 80 countries. He's also a speaker, author, and an educator that teaches around the world. We'll get his perspective on how traveling can help elevate our understanding of not just the world, but also of our inner self. We're pleased to have with us Joel Bond. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me today. Glad to be here.
So Joel, when we first connected some time ago, I thought, what better way to grow the Witness the World podcast than to connect with someone that has witnessed so much of the world already? I understand that your travels have covered over 6 continents, which is amazing. So to start us off, could you please tell us a bit about, what was it that brought out your passion for travel so many years ago?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I blame my mother and I blame genetics. So when I was younger, my parents were very outward focused. They were really interested in what the world had to offer, but we didn't have enough money to travel. And so they decided to bring the world to our doorstep. And so growing up, I had mother's field trips to, the art museums. She would make connections with people in the community and bring them over for dinner. I remember one really strong memory when I was a kid is we hosted 2 Kenyan boys who were part of a national touring boy choir from Africa. And I remember they were only with us for like 2 or 3 days, but it felt like an entire summer. I just have such great memories of like hanging out with these 2 kids from Kenya. And so, we had all these sort of inspirational moments where my parents would bring in people from around the world to our doorstep and connect us with people from other cultures. And I think it's also, my mother, when she was growing up, always just had this insatiable curiosity. I think it just is genetically written into my sequence here, to have this insatiable curiosity to want to explore and discover what's around the next corner. And she talks about when she was a kid, always wanting to hop on her bike and and ride down to see the construction of the new interstate in Chicago where she was living, or to ride the bike down to, the corner market, or to go to, old downtown where she was. And her neighbor's mother once said, Linda, why do you always going to be going somewhere? And I feel like that trait has just been passed down to me as well. Like I just feel like I have to go somewhere and always explore the next thing, see what's around the corner. So I blame my mother, I blame genetics, and my upbringing, I think, just really fed into me this idea of being a world traveler and exploring and connecting with people who were from other places.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, that's cool stuff, Joel. So when you do go head out onto your next adventure, you're planning things out. Like, what's your typical approach? Like, are you a planner that has, map out, let's say, 80% of the trip, or do you just wing it, or take some kind of hybrid approach? And then also the type of traveling. Are you more of a solo backpacker type that will just kind of go out there on your own? Maybe you can just tell us about your approach to travel.
I've done all types. I've done everything from the, package, tour group, here's the cruise ship kind of thing, where everything is planned out for you, all the way down to being the backpacker who just wings it and shows up without a guidebook and decides to see what there is. I've kind of done the whole spectrum. My sort of go-to is I do tend to be a bit of a planner. but I also tend to be budget and backpacker. So I tend to enjoy picking a destination, seeing what there is, reading about it as much as I can before I go, and then mapping out sort of key things that I'd really like to do, but also building into that some flexibility and just seeing how it plays out once I'm there. So that tends to be my go-to personal style. I have organized tours and trips for other people as well, in which case I'm much more organized and give them a detailed itinerary, step by step. Here's what you'll do each day. But my own personal style tends to be a bit more free form, leave a little bit of room for discovery, because I think that's the joy of travel is to see what you can discover. You know, if you if you knew everything about where you were going, then why would you go, right? You could you could just check out the DVD or read the book, but the joy of it is actually sort of the spontaneity of being in that new destination. So
Right. Okay. Yeah. So exploring the unknown, just putting it out there, and yeah, just be open to that experience. I guess is part of the experience and enjoying the experience. So part of your adventures there, you must have been seen some pretty memorable things, some highlights. What are one or two of the highlights that come to mind for you over the years?
oh man, there are so many. Oh goodness. I think for me, some of my highlights are I mean, they really are the unexpected moments, those unplanned moments. I have a specific memory of taking a road trip to Mosul in northern Iraq, where I was able to connect with a local resident there who showed us around town and became a really good friend, actually. And he also had invited two other Spanish young men who were traveling, couch surfing through the area. And so the four of us kind of all ended up creating a little travel group and exploring Mosul. These two Spanish men then came back and visited me in my hometown in Kurdistan, where I was living at the time. And through those connections, I ended up making these connections to then go hike the Camino in Spain the following summer. So it was all very spontaneous, these sort of link to a link to a link, the chain reaction. Similar instance, I was traveling in the Baltic states. I was in Estonia, I believe, and met through couch surfing a local boy from Saudi Arabia who 6 months later ended up opening the door for me to visit him in Riyadh and exploring and experiencing Saudi Arabia, which until that point had been closed to travelers unless you were there on business. So those sorts of connections, I think, with people as I've been traveling, those spontaneous, unplanned, like, who am I going to meet while I'm there? I think those moments have really made those travel memories the most obviously there's the big things like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I get to see X world monument, or I get to see this sort of thing, or had this experience, but it really is the people you meet along the way that really make those experiences memorable.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for sharing, Joel. So you mentioned Mosul, Iraq. So I understand that you were there, you lived there for a bit, you were doing some work at a school there. I mean, wonder if you could just share a bit about that experience. I guess first off, like, why did you decide to pick there to go like live and do some work there? And yeah, what was that like? If you can just share a bit about that.
Yeah, so I lived in Iraq, in northern Iraq, the Kurdistan region, for 7 years. Loved it from 2016 till just this last year, 2022, I left. And the decision to move there was kind of an accident, to be honest. I'd been living in the UK prior to that and had left my job. I'd worked as a flight attendant for a short time and had kind of a dead space between that career and shifting to something else. So I wasn't sure what I wanted to do just yet. But I'd had some teaching experience and a minor teaching qualification, and saw this advertisement drop into my spam box one day, actually, from a website called EnglishJobsInTurkey.com. And it offered this really good salary to teach at the school in the Kurdistan region, which in my mind, because of the website, I thought it was the Kurdish region of Turkey. And so I was like, oh, this sounds great. Like, I love Turkey. I've been there before. Like, let's just apply and see what happens. And the next day I had a Zoom conversation with the director of the school. And he was like, we're so glad you want to come and live in Iraq. And I just like had to put on my best poker face and be like, yes, tell me more about Iraq. Because at the time, ISIS was still active and it was still headlines, all over the news. And so I did a little bit of my due diligence research to figure out what it was really like on the ground. And it was in a city I'd never heard of and never made any news headlines. 2 million people lived there. And I thought, great, like, this is 2 million people who go about their daily lives and do their normal things and visit grandma and go buy milk from the store and go play football with their friends. And so surely I can go and experience the same kind of everyday life that these people are living. So kind of just bit the bullet and decided to try it. I really liked the Middle East in general, although I'd never been to Iraq itself, and but enjoyed the culture and enjoyed the food and the hospitality. And I thought, well, just give it a try. If I don't like it, there are airplanes there. There are airplanes that leave as well. So I went thinking I might stay for 2 months, and I stayed for 7 years.
Huh, okay. Interesting stuff, Joel. So, it's when I look at world events, it's been like 13 years since the U.S. has, pulled the troops out of Iraq, and I'm just curious, like you as a American guy, going to that region, like how were you received by? It sounds like you were well received by the school, but what about like the locals there? Like if you're, out roaming around, out and about in your free time, like what was the vibe like on the scene there? Right? I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that.
My number one thing that I say to people is what you see in the news is true, but represents only 1% of reality. And if you're going to decide where you go in the world based solely on news headlines, by the same logic, I would never move back to America because of political upheaval, Black Lives Matters, protests, gun violence, school shootings, etc. You name it. There's a whole litany of things that show up across the news every day that, if it bleeds, it leads, right? It's that sort of, the drama sells. But you and I both know that daily life in the US is pretty normal. You don't fear for your life every time you go to the mall necessarily. You don't sit there and have, big political upheaval discussions every moment of every day. You end up doing your job, you go to work, you go to the supermarket, we do all the things that you do as a normal human being to live your life. And in Iraq, it was very much the same. And while, yes, there was a certain amount of resistance to American presence in the country. For the most part, people were very well receptive because the US that had come in had removed a dictator for them. And so for a lot of people, that was a really positive thing. And there's also a really keen distinction between American politics and American people, which I think we do a poor job of distinguishing in the US. We tend to lump people together with their politics. You voted for this party, then I don't like you anymore. Whereas in the Middle East, I found in general they have a much more nuanced discussion. Whereas I had friends who could say, you know what, we don't like US foreign policy and we don't like what's happening in on the politics, but we think Americans are friendly people and we think that you are welcome here. And so there was a distinction that was made very early on in a lot of relationships that I formed over there, where people were easy and keen to say, we like you, but we don't like the politics that you come with. And that didn't impede any kind of relational friendships from forming. It was just simply a matter of fact. There's a difference of opinion in politics, but hey, let's go drink tea together, or let's go smoke shisha, or let's go to the park. Like it was a very open, welcome, inviting sort of experience. Sure, there were neighborhoods that were less welcoming, and there were certain demographic groups that were less welcoming. But as a whole, I found it was a very welcoming, hospitable place, and I really didn't fear for my safety at all for the entire time that I was there.
Well, that's a great perspective there, Joel. Yeah, no, it's good to hear that it's more than meets the eye, when you listen to the news. So that's good that, yeah, people should kind of do a little more digging. And yeah, like yourself, your lived experience has been positive. So that's good. Just one more question then, I guess, you touched on it where, obviously a dictator was removed in Iraq and 13 years later, what's your sense of like the people there? Do they feel they're better off now? Now things have really moved forward for them. Things are transitioning, evolving in a way better kind of pathway. Would you say? Is that the general sense there?
That's going to get a much more mixed response from locals. The common sentiment that I heard was that they removed one dictator to be replaced by many dictators, that the change in politics was less of a change and more of a shift, a reshuffling. I have friends who think that in general there's some hope, but I would say overall the sentiment is that things have not progressed as they would have liked. And so there's a bit of a lack of hope in terms of the future and the younger generation, what they think can happen with Iraq and how it can develop. That said, economically, on paper, the country is up and to the right. That, of course, is on paper. The reality and the lived experience of people on the ground is less so. There's economic crisis. That money doesn't necessarily stay in country, gets filtered out through, third-party holding companies and, oil businesses and investment from abroad. So a lot of that money kind of gets funneled to other places or gets laundered, unfortunately, or the corruption within the politics and the political system. Things tend not to trickle down into the general population, economically speaking. So, well, there's a lot of construction boom and a lot of development and a lot of infrastructure that's there in the country that is, so you can look around. There's construction cranes everywhere. It's rebuilding and it's up and to the right. On the graph, it just is like, oh yeah, like things are developing. The reality and the lived experience is less so and is a bit more nuanced. So I think the overall sentiment from people there is that no, things have not really changed for the better, but things are changing and it's to be determined what that would look like.
Yeah, thanks for your take, Joel. So I want to pivot over to another travel experience that you were experienced back in, I think during the pandemic time. You were traveling away and you got kind of stuck in Greece for a while. So I wonder, like, how did that all came about, and how did you navigate through that particular experience?
Yeah, the pandemic was, well, it was a unique experience for everybody. I mean, few people and nobody that I know has lived through anything similar to that. It really shifted our perspective on the world and our personal selves and introspection, and as well as how we view the world and safety and health. So many things came out of that. For me personally, I had decided to take a spring break, an early spring break vacation to just sort of sidestep from the intensity of what was living in Iraq. And for all the positive things that I can say about it, it is still an intense place to live in. And I was also midway through a master's degree and decided I needed just a break to refocus and recenter what I wanted to do and where I was going. And so I packed a carry-on bag and decided I was going to go to a remote Greek island and just sort of downshift for a bit. I was going to spend a little bit more than I normally would on a vacation and just kind of downshift and unplug, de-stress for a week. Well, the day I arrived on this remote Greek island, the World Health Organization used the words global pandemic, and borders closed, airports were shut, and what was going to be a 1 week vacation with my carry-on bag on this island stretched out into 5 long months where I couldn't leave. And of course, at the time, we didn't know how long it was going to be. Everything was just another 2 weeks. Oh, another 2 weeks. Oh, another 2 weeks. And so it was this interminable process of just waiting in this hotel, wondering what I was going to do and how I was going to survive. And have I accidentally moved to Greece forever, for the rest of my life? So it was during that time that I discovered a refugee camp on the island where I was living. And as restrictions locally started to lift, I was able to explore the island. And here I am, a man from the West, caught in Greece, trying to get back to his home in the Middle East, when I discover all these Middle Easterners who are caught in Greece trying to gain asylum status in the West. And so our paths intersected, and I ended up volunteering to teach English in the refugee camp for the last 2.5 months I was there. And that experience really shifted my perspective on what it means to find a place to call home, not just physically, geographically, but in your own heart, in your own being, in your own sort of soul, in your own head. What does it mean to find an identity, to say this is who I am and this is where I am and what I'm doing in the world? And it was through those conversations and those connections with refugees and that time of self-reflection as we were all isolated from friends and family and people we know and love that I was able to then write my book, As Large as Your Spirit, that discusses that entire experience and talks about that journey of growth. So really a phenomenal experience. I tell people it was an amazing experience I wish to never repeat. um, but that I learned a lot and I grew a lot from that experience. And I'm really proud of the work that I've put out there. Just recently, this last year, the book was reached a finalist category. It didn't win, but it reached a finalist stage in the Best Independent Book Awards. So I'm really proud of that.
Wow. Okay. Good stuff, Joel. And yeah, it sounds like you made the best out of a bad or unexpected situation, perhaps, and then turn a positive on that. So that's good. And I mean, part of the journey for traveling is exploring the unknown. Sometimes you don't know what's going to happen the next day, or what the World Health Organization does, or any other kind of parties. So during I guess during all this time there, like you must have encountered some other kind of challenging or maybe dicey situations in your travel. You do the solo backpacking. I mean, you can be prepared as you want to be prepared, but it's just sometimes just things just happen. And are there any kind of like situation stories that come to mind where you were kind of wondering like, oh, this particular situation, oh, this is yeah, getting kind of dicey. Anything kind of sticks out over your, covering 80 plus countries, anything that kind of jumps out at you?
Well, yeah, there is one very, very prominent scenario, which for all the positive things that I say about Iraq, this is going to counteract that. And I hesitate to bring the story up only because I want people to recognize that Iraq really is a beautiful and amazing place and you should go and visit. However, my personal experience at the end was one of intense threat to personal safety. In that, because I had lived there for so long and I was a visible, known person in the community, I'm clearly a Western, American that's there helping rebuild education in a post-conflict society, bringing in my Western ideals. I had published a book that sort of, about refugees and about self-reflection, which kind of picked a little bit at some scabs of the society there and ran culture, counter to the culture. I had a number of things that made me a visible presence in the community there. And while Iraq is a very safe place, there does remain a small group of bad actors that don't want American influence or thought that my particular presence there was a threat. And so I thought everything was fine. I was a little bit oblivious to my influence that I had in my local community. And at that point, I received a phone call from the State Department telling me that there was a threat to my safety in the country and that I personally needed to leave. And so I was given 24 hours to pack my bags and evacuate. And so I ended up leaving behind 7 years of my life in that space in a very dramatic whirlwind weekend, packed two suitcases and left everything else, shut the door behind me, and got on the airplane in the middle of the night and disappeared, knowing that I would never be able to go back. So that created a really traumatic departure from a place that I loved and immediately cut an end to all the relationships, all the work, all of the life that I'd had there. So yes, it's that's the most dramatic scenario that I can come up with. I don't think anything really gets more dramatic than that in terms of things that got dicey. I will never really truly know the full reason why I personally was asked to leave because all my other expat friends are still there in country. I can only speculate, but I think that it probably has just something to do with my visibility and my influence in the country and how vocal I was on certain issues. And that cut against the grain of people who didn't, agree with the same things that I was saying. So
Interesting. Okay, yeah, thanks for sharing that story, Joel. So, I mean, you did, fondly kind of reflect back on the experience itself, the people. So, I gather it's not going to take away too much of the good memories from you there, but I guess we all need to be aware, the climate there when we're going to travel and like you do, a lot of research. So, yeah, thanks for sharing again, Joel. So, I guess one thing you did touch on is like when we go travel around, and a lot of people, they part of their, growth journey, learning around the world, you learn different languages, you learn culture. And for you, I think you've learned all those things and probably more. What are maybe one of the two biggest like growth spurts that you've had going through traveling and that really kind of hits you from when you started traveling to now? Like, what's really kind of developed within yourself?
oh wow, that's a really good question. I've never been asked that one before. Growth spurts in traveling. Ooh. I think I'm going to go for a practical one first. The first thing that comes to mind is just learning how to pack. We all, for the most part, have been other places, whether it's in your own state or, visit your grandma or you've traveled half around the world and found ourselves overpacking, taking more than what we needed. And I remember,
The big rolling suitcase is probably not recommended, I'm guessing.
no. Oh my goodness, no. I mean, you do unfortunately see the giant rolling suitcase in the corner here. That is because I moved my entire life to live here permanently for a number of years. So I did have to check a suitcase. But generally speaking, when I do travel, if I'm traveling, not moving someplace, but traveling someplace, I tend to just go carry on. And my biggest inspiration for that is a guy named Doug Diamond, and he's got a website called onebag.net, I believe. And the most comprehensive site ever on how to just pack minimally, but without sacrificing comfort. And everything you need, you can have in a carry-on bag and pack and live indefinitely out of it, which made, consequently, my 5 months in Greece with my one carry-on bag pretty livable, to be honest. Because by that point, I had mastered my art of packing and was able to sort of live indefinitely out of my carry-on bag for those 5 months. So that's probably one of my biggest growth spurts there is just learning and understanding how to pack for sort of every eventuality, but with minimal space and keeping things light, without overpacking and lugging everything. You have to carry everything yourself, most places if you're an independent backpacker. So onebag.net, just sort of that really revolutionized the way that I travel. I think the second thing that was a really big growth spurt for me in traveling in general, I'm going to give a shout out to couch surfing. Couchsurfing.org. If anybody's familiar with that, you may or may not be. I call it Facebook for travelers. It's a social media network basically for people who are traveling. You can create a profile and you can host people who are coming to your town where you're living. So travelers who are there, you can have them stay in your place and you can show them around, play tour guide for them. And likewise, it's a sort of pay it forward system. When you travel to somewhere else, you can stay with strangers you've never met before who then become friends. And that for me has become one of the biggest game changers for travel. And it does take a certain personality to be willing to do that. But I've found, even if I'm staying in a hotel, to go on couch surfing and just find locals who are willing to go out for dinner. I don't have to necessarily stay in their homes, but just find locals and figure out like, what do you do? Where are you going? What do are you free this weekend? I would love to explore and have a conversation and find out more about the culture. And I've ended up making some of my best friends through random couch surfing encounters. Actually, one of my first couch surfing experiences early on ended up going back to visit several times, and 2 years later, I was best man in his wedding. So, and it was just a total, stranger kind of coincidence. Ended up when I was a flight attendant, would stay in these five-star hotels, didn't need to stay in somebody's home, but ended up making friends with a local couch surfer in Baku, Azerbaijan, who absolutely just opened my eyes to the culture. I loved visiting. I ended up flying there several times. Towards the end, chose not to stay in the five-star hotel and stayed in his little home on the other side of the city. And his mother would make dinner for me, and we just hang out and had a full-on cultural immersion experience. And so those two things, I think, learning to pack minimally and learning how to connect, how to sort of, because I had such minimal possessions, was able to just go maximum into the relationships of the people that I meet when I travel through couch surfing. So those two things are my big growth spurts, I'd say.
Oh, great tips there, Joel. I'll make sure I put those links up on our show notes, and I'll have to check it out too, as I'm going to be going traveling next month. So I'll try to pack a little bit more efficiently. So, just to kind of move over to where you are now. So you're in the Ivory Coast, and I understand you are doing a teaching assignment over there. And wonder, yeah, if you can just tell us, like, in your current destination, like, what piqued your interest to go to the Ivory Coast? And yeah, you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Ivory Coast really caught my attention. I was looking for a new teaching assignment. I had obviously been evacuated out of my last position, and so spent a year back in the US, kind of figuring out what I wanted to do and where I wanted to go. And it's always been a little bit of a goal of mine to live on every continent, and I had visited Africa, but had never lived on the African continent. And this position came through in my email box one day. It was here in the Ivory Coast, which is a francophone country, and I speak French and hadn't used my French for a while. So I thought, this sounds like a great opportunity to try something new, to live on a continent never lived on before, and to engage with the language that I know already and would love to sort of keep and practice. And so it really just sort of ticked all the boxes of newness, of curiosity, that sort of let's see what's around the next corner for me. And yeah, that was really it. There was really nothing other than it just ticked all those right boxes for me in terms of discovery for something new. So when the opportunity came along, I thought, well, this is the best out of the options that have come across my inbox. Let's see what happens and try it out.
Okay, interesting. So you've been there for a little while, I think a couple of months, if I'm not mistaken, and so you have a bit of a grasp of the area. So if you were to sell me or anybody else listening on, a potential trip to go visit Ivory Coast, what would your pitch be like?
Well, you got a great host with couch surfing, and this is where you'd stay. So, come and visit. But in terms of things to see and do, so I am based in Abidjan, which is the economic capital of the city of the country. And, it has been a pretty steep uphill learning curve in terms of getting involved in the community here. But there's a really good music and art scene here. So if you're interested in African art, if you're interested in African music, there's plenty of clubs and galleries and places to go and explore that. If you're interested in old colonial history, so a lot of these countries were, former colonial powers had come in and carved up, and divided up the tribal lines differently and whatever. So there's some colonial history that's there, which is still present in certain parts. So Grand Bassam, which is a town about 45 minutes to an hour from here, has a lot of colonial heritage buildings. It's where the French first came in and sort of made their outpost. So that has an interesting checkered history, which is interesting to just see. And in terms of natural beauty, I have yet to explore further inland yet, but I know there are regions in the west of the country with some mountains and some beautiful natural parks. Just here in Abidjan itself, there's the Forêt de Banco, which is just a giant nature reserve, and underneath holds the city's aquifer. So basically, all of the water supply for the city comes through, filtered through the forest there, and that's beautiful. Walk there. And if you go further north, there's the actual capital, the political capital, Yamoussoukro, and then all the way to the north with places like Korogo, where you get different tribal elements. So there's lots of sort of four main tribes that occupy modern Ivory Coast, and each of their own sort of ethnic cultures and cultures, different technique, different things that they do, different foods and music and dress and styles. So it would be kind of it's a new place to discover. It's not really on the tourist trail. And so it would be you'd be a trailblazer to really come to Ivory Coast as a tourist.
Well, thanks for the overview, Joel. I will, keep it on the radar, do a little digging, and yeah, I might come a knocking, I guess, if I decide to make the trip over there. So yeah, thanks for that. So I want to kind of pivot over to, I guess, a little bit bigger global topics, and this is going to be kind of good to get your perspectives, being, a world traveler like you are, and you've connected with so many people, and had encounters with people from all different countries, migration and refugees. So like you kind of seen, heard, and different experiences from people around the world, crossing paths, going to different places. So one thing I wanted to know about is, watch a lot of podcast interviews with people from, the so-called second world, third world countries, and it's interesting that, listening to some interviews and, me traveling around the world, in conversation with some people, like there's a sense that, some people have felt like they feel more happy, more fulfilled, despite the fact that they have less economically, like from an economic perspective, they have less, and then they also have less options in life. And then you compare that with people in the first world. I know some people that, yeah, they don't, they're not as happy, and because there are too many options, maybe. So it's kind of quite the conundrum there. So is that your sense around the world? Just curious, yeah, what have you kind of seen as far as like happiness, fulfillment, people around the world versus, first world where we both come from?
Yeah, that's a really nuanced question there. And I think I want to answer that with a couple of ideas. The first one is there is a bit of a diminishing returns when it comes to economic wealth. And there's psychological research out there that over a certain amount of money, people are not necessarily happier. And it's by American standards, I think it's $70,000 a year, something to that effect, which is, higher than some, but not that's not an exorbitant sum for a lot of Americans, and particularly if you're, on the coastal regions, if you're in California and New York, I mean, that's not enough money to live off for a lot of people. So, there's a diminishing returns in terms of economics and happiness. And I think you're also right on the money when you talk about having too much choice. There's a certain paralysis by over choice. And I think that when you have too many options, you can end up making no choice at all, which then sort of leaves you stagnant. You're not progressing, you're not developing, you're kind of sat there stymied by what you do next. And so I think that plays into part of it. When you don't have as many options, you simply do what you can do to do the next thing. And that keeps you moving and keeps you growing. The final thing that I'd say is, I read a number of years ago a book called The Happiness Hypothesis, and he talks about happiness in terms of like a mathematical equation. I can't remember the author's name at this point off the top of my head, but he talks about how happiness equals pleasure plus purpose over time. Happiness equals pleasure plus purpose over time. And that we need to have a balance of pursuing pleasurable things, things we like, things that we enjoy, as well as having a purpose, doing something that feels meaningful. And that those two things in balance with each other, played out over time, is what creates happiness. Happiness might be very fleeting in the moment, but in aggregate, over a lifetime, if you've got a balance of pleasure and purpose, then you can call yourself, say that you've had a happy life. And I think in the West, we tend to really put those two things out of balance. You're either working the, 80-hour work week, burnout, this is your purpose, but you aren't doing anything pleasurable, or you're hedonistic and doing all the things that you love, but not really having any sort of purpose and driving yourself forward, or having any time to self-reflect or to grow, or what are you going to change? What are you going to do differently with your life? And so I think keeping those things balanced is really what helps you develop happiness. And I think when you're in these developing countries and in developing places, your purpose and your pleasure, both of those, I just think are simpler. We complicate them in the West. We want our purpose to be, some big grand ideal, when I think our purpose in lives is to make meaning. And I think when you are in a developing situation, developing an economy, your purpose in life is to love those around you, to connect and to be in relationship with people. And that in and of itself is often pleasurable. And so you have this very simplistic mathematical formula of you're surrounded by people you love, and your job is to take care of them, and you do that over your entire lifetime. Sure, you're happy. That perhaps oversimplifies the entire idea, and there's far much more nuance to it. But I think to bring things down to just a really a basic summary. That's what I would say. And then that's what I found to be true myself is by curating a certain life, by curating certain possessions, certain relationships, certain experiences, and doing that over time, you create that same kind of happiness, that same sort of lifestyle.
Well, that's an interesting perspective, Joel. So maybe the concept of less is more, us in the first world maybe need to adopt that a little bit more, kind of incorporate that because too many options. Yeah, analysis paralysis, I think, is another term that people use, like whatever they do in life. So kind of keep that balance and in check and not forget to keep it in mind. So, wow, yeah, no, that's a good perspective, Joel. So, in the pursuit of happiness for people around the world, a big trend over the last 5 to 10 years is global migration. People, go into different countries, and you cross paths with people going different directions. You go one way, they're going another way, and a lot of migrations happening in places like Europe, a lot of countries there from the Middle East, and then also obviously in the United States through the southern border. And like through your lived experience, your interactions with everybody, yeah, just wondering what do you see as like kind of like the biggest drivers for these changes? I mean, there's a lot of underlying factors I know, but you spoke and you come across many people. What have they said to you as their reasons to kind of seek happiness and seek a life elsewhere?
Whew. This is gonna go a little counter to my previous answer, but I think people are in that global migration process because they're seeking more options. They're seeking a better life. And the locations where they have come from haven't provided them the resources or the opportunities or the tools to do that. So when I speak about, my connection with refugees in particular, for a lot of them, their motivation was really just to simply have a choice. And I think this is where there's a bit of a scale. I've come to understand a bit of a 3-point scale on this. You have on one end having no choice at all or very limited options. And then you have this idea, if you come from that environment where you have no choice, you have this dream, this goal to have choice, to be able to make a decision. And if you've never had that opportunity, you haven't had those right opportunities to make those right decisions for whatever domain that you're interested in, then your dream for freedom, your idea of freedom, is the ability to make a choice, the ability to make choices of any nature. And so there's a migration, there's this movement from having limited or restricted choice to I want to be able to make choices for myself, to have that kind of authority, autonomy over my own decisions, my own life. And I think there's another point beyond that in terms of freedom. And I would say that it's the ability to say no to things you truly desire. I think that spectrum continues from having no choice to being able to make choices to then being able to choose to say no, knowing that there are other options that you can select, that you can choose this thing and not that thing, to be really intentional about the choices that you make and to say no to certain things, knowing that something better is in the pipeline, perhaps, or that other options will present themselves that are better than these ones that you currently have at the moment. And so I think in the West, our idea of freedom, we tend to have this idea of it's being able to do whatever the hell you want, right? Freedom is, freedom. Let's do whatever we can. But I think true freedom internally, the kind of mastery, self-control concept of autonomy, of independence, of being your own person, is the ability to say no to things that you think you may desire. And so, yeah, to give it a really stupid context, I have the choice to go and get a coffee every day, right? I could go out and buy a coffee every day of my life if I wanted to. I have the economic means to do so. But real freedom is to be able to say, no, I'm not gonna spend $4 on a coffee. I'm gonna stay at home and work on this project instead, or brew my own coffee, which I have in my kitchen, so it's cheaper that way. And it's a really stupid example. It's a really basic example, but writ large across all of society's choices and society's options that we have, true freedom is being able to make those choices and say no to the things that maybe we desire, because in that you demonstrate mastery, control over your life, having a curated, purposeful, intentional life, that purpose that we've talked about that helps create happiness in life. So it's a bit of a long-winded roundabout answer to your question, but I think that idea of migration is that desire to have more choice. And I wish more than anything else that those who are moving towards more choice would eventually come to understand as well that movement towards self-control as the ultimate choice of freedom.
That's an interesting concept there, Joel. So, yeah, I mean, it makes total sense to me. I mean, everyone trying to pursue more options, and just, I guess it gets to a point when you have too many options, then that's where you need to look deep within yourself and say, okay, like how best am I optimizing my life with those options? If you get to that point and you lose sight of that, then maybe you're not moving your life forward. But those that don't have any options, then yeah, you got to go out and try to pursue a couple options. So yeah, okay.
Yeah. To bring it back to us to an earlier example as well, you could choose to take everything with you on your next travel. You could choose to take the rolling suitcase packed with the kitchen sink and everything else. Or you could exercise restraint and choose to say no to some of the things that you might want to take with you, but you don't have to. And choose to pack lighter, pack simpler, and as a result, have more engaging experiences at the other end because you're not relying on all of your stuff to accompany you. You're relying on relationships and the spontaneity of those that will develop along the way to really inform your experience. That's perhaps a better example of that spectrum from having no choice to having choice to being able to say no to things.
That's a great way to kind of wrap up things here, Joel. I like how you kind of summarized that. And but before we let you go here today, I always want to end off asking my guests a two-parter question to close. So here goes. What are you most grateful for, and what are you most looking forward to in the future?
Ooh. I'm really grateful for, I've had so many great experiences in life. The opportunities that I've had to be able to travel as extensively as I have, and the relationships that I've made along the way that have informed who I am and developed me as a person. And I think more than that, I'm really grateful for my ability to not just have those experiences, but reflect and incorporate them. Like reflect on them and know how they have formed me, to see what they're doing to change me and shape me. So I'd say I'm probably most grateful for my ability to, for lack of another word, introspect, my ability to analyze the world that I'm living in and seeing how it's influencing me. What am I most looking forward to? Oh goodness. I heard someone once say, what if the best years of your life are still ahead of you? And I think we have this idea in the West, at least in North American culture, that youth is the be all end all, like, oh, the glory days of our youth. But, what if the best times are still ahead of me? What if I am an old man that does something amazing, creates something new, discovers the next whatever, wins some incredible prize, for the work that I do. I don't know. Like, what if those days are still ahead of me? And so I think for me, the thing I'm most looking forward to is the unknown, the joy of discovering what the next thing is going to be around the next corner. And I think that's what keeps me traveling and keeps me curious.
Terrific. Well said, Joel. So if people want to know more about you, where can they find you?
I'm all over the internet at Joel David Bond. So my website is joeldavidbond.com. Instagram at Joel David Bond, Facebook at Joel David Bond, LinkedIn at Joel David Bond. Basically, Google my full name, you'll find me. And my book, As Large as Your Spirit, by Joel David Bond, of course, is available on Amazon, on global networks, in paperback, hardback, or Kindle.
Great. Thanks for sharing, Joel. We'll be sure to add those details to our show notes. So that's a wrap for episode 32. If you like this podcast, please give it a thumbs up or hit the subscribe button below. If you didn't like this podcast, give it a thumbs down, but please do tell us why with a comment below. If you have any other comments, feedback, or suggestions, you know what to do. Thanks for joining us, and namaste, everyone.
Yeah.